Hello and welcome back to Spring into Java. This is Galave, your mentor and tutor. In this part, we're going to set up our initial project. So, without further ado, we're going to bring up our favorite IDE. In my case, it is IntelliJ IDEA. When this comes up, we're just going to simply create a new project. In here, we're going to choose the Spring Initializer. We're going to give our project a name, which will just be this library. And we're going to go with the default spot. We want to create a Git repository so that we have some version control. We're using Java. We are going to make this into a Maven project. And a few of the reasons I choose Maven over Gradle are just personal choices, because Maven is my dependency or project management tool of choice. Generally, it has a fairly easy to follow extensible markup language, like Excel. It is a well organized tool, as well as great for pure Java application projects. So, after that, we're going to simply give it a package or a group. In my case, that would be typically this is something that is the reverse of your domain. In my case, it is glabestudios.xyz. So, to represent that, we will just go backwards xyz.glabestudios. From there, we're going to give the artifact a name, which is, just so we have a little bit of difference, I'm going to call that dislib. Now you'll see the package name. The package name goes to the domain or the group, and then it appends the artifact name to it just for packaging. We do want to make sure we're using Java 17, and we want this to be a jar because, quite frankly, let's make jar, not war. Next screen, we're going to want to implement a few starting dependencies. So I won't go too in depth into why I'm picking what I'm picking at this point, but just to get started, we're going to use Lombok, as that will save us a lot of boilerplate code. We're going to take in Spring Web. For a template engine to build our pages, we're going to be using Timeleaf. This is a personal preference for me because it is a very well structured HTML language that allows you to create objects, very much like an object oriented programming, where you build your different classes that define the different parts of your application. This allows you to simply cookie cutter, copy, or create redundant pages or elements, which I will get more into as we go when I talk more about fragmentations. As for security, we're not going to worry about that right now. We will implement that later. We're going to use an H2 database. This is not ideal for production. This is mainly for the development process. We will be eventually opting for a more dedicated database or structured database, such as PostSQL or just simply SQL. From here, that is about all that we need for here. So we can go ahead and create that project. Now we'll just go ahead and let this open up, do its thing. It will build all the necessary files, GitHub repository, and you'll see, there we go. So I'm just going to get rid of that. First thing I'm going to do is get rid of this help.md once it's been done. Maven dependency does allow for you to automatically refresh your dependencies in the background. So this will be another thing that we will do in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and pause this while I let the rest of my IDE load up, and we'll be back in a minute. Alright, so everything is loaded now. I'm just going to go in and do a couple of quick little personalizations here. Straighten this up. I'm going to personally toggle skip test modes, just so that every time I compile, it's not rerunning. Also, I'm going to go to the auto reload settings, and I'm going to tell this for any change. That is just a personal preference, so that when we edit the POM file, it will refresh automatically in the background, so that we're not going through and trying to refresh. So there's a few things in here that we're going to change up just by default. One of these is going to be the version number. So just going to leave that at 0.01 for now. We are using the latest version of Spring, and everything else looks good. So from here, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a file called application.properties. Now, generally this would be in your source, main, and then resources folder. You'll see that by default, application.properties is created. We're going to jump on into here. Give myself a little more screen. We're going to dive on in, and here we're going to have to state a few defaults. Now, first thing we want to know is what port we're going to be running our web app on, or which port we're going to be running our web server on. So to do that, we simply just type in server.port followed by an equals, and by default it's 8080. So we're just going to leave it as that for now. The next thing I also want to do is I want to turn off the white label message. So server.error, by default it is set to true. However, we want to make sure that the server error white label enabled is actually set to false. Next, after this, there will be a couple of logging things we should be using here or setting by default. So, for example, our logging level for the logging level, we want to set the root to info. This will just mainly print out just informative messages versus every little bit of detailed message that we don't necessarily want to see. Now, the next thing under here is we're going to look to set up, and I'm actually going to separate this, so we'll call this logging information. Next, I'm going to set up the H2 database. So in here, there's a few things that we want to make sure that we set up. We want to set up the H2 console to be enabled. We want to give it a specific path. We are going to disable trace, and we are going to, for now, set it so that it will allow others to view it. This is just more or less a personal preference for when we're going about accessing and viewing the table later on. So, without ado here, so we're going to go to spring.html, h2, and we're going to set the defaults here. So we want to enable this true. We also want to be able to give it path. So spring.h2 path. By default, it's generally /h2-console, but for the sake of this, this is going to be our admin control panel, so ACP. Now, don't worry too much about what that means at this moment. I'll explain that more once we run the project and get a little bit more look at it. Now, I also said we were going to turn off tracing, so spring.h2 and turn off tracing. Now, in order to allow or disallow others to view this console from an external IP, so that h2 console, allow others, we're going to set that to, true. This is just something so that if while we're testing this, you want to be able to double check the database, say from a different device, you'll be able to do so. Well, I will explain more into that as we get into it. Now, it's great, we have a console set up, but what goes into the console? Well, that's going to basically be where you'll access the database. It will look very structured to a typical PHP myadmin, if anybody is familiar with that from back in the day. And the next thing that we're looking to set up here is going to be the data source. So what this means is basically where is all this data going to be stored at. So in here we want to go spring dot data source dot URL. This is going to be the path of your database. So because we are using an H2 database, this is going to be a JDBC H2 file. All right, so JDBC, it's an H2, and it is a file. Now, where is that file? That file is going to be created. We're going to make it in the root directory. We're going to store it in a folder called database, and we're just going to simply call this one warehouse, because it's just simply going to be a warehouse of data. All right. Now, next, we need to tell it what kind of driver we're using. So, spring.dataSource driver class name. So here, this one is going to be org.h2.driver. Simple. That's it. Although you need that driver to be a capital D. Next, we're going to need to set up a username and password. This will be how we log in to the admin console. So spring.dataSource name, username, and this is again going to be just our admin account, so I'm just going to call this admin. Real fancy. Spring.dataSource password. And again, this should be something secure, but for the sake of this video and course, I'm just going to use a simple password as password. I highly recommend that you don't do that. Use something auto-generated, encrypted. Don't use password. That's just bad practice. So that would be all that we need to set up for here inside of our application.properties. We will eventually be breaking this up into profiles so that we can have one set of credentials or information for our development environment, as well as another for our um, production environment. Now, the next thing, sorry, there is one more thing that we need to do in here before we do this. We need to set up the Java Persistence API data, or the JPA data. Now, the Java Persistence API would be the information for how we store our information. So in here, we want to go to spring.jpa and database platform. So here we need to tell it what type of database this is. So this is an org hibernate dialect, and it is an H2 H2 dialect. Next, spring.jpa. We also want to set the open in view. We're going to set this to false for now, just so that we are the only ones who can view it. Next is we want to set up how our data source or how our Hibernate database is going to be generating the information that gets put into the tables. There's a few different things you can do for this, but for the purpose of development, we're going to be using what's known as update, which will simply update the database tables as they need be versus creating them every time that the project is run, or creating them every time, or sorry, not creating them. Generally in production, we would have this set to validate, which is just going to validate the integrity of our database and not actually update any of the tables, rows, or data. But for the sake of the development purposes, we're going to go into spring.jpa, and we're going to tell it that the Hibernate DLL auto, so this is the mode, we want it to be update. And again, as you can see, there are different options here. So update will update the schema of the database if needed. So only if there's ever been a change or a new thing has been added, it will update that. If you happen to remove a field from a Java object, that won't remove the table, because it's kind of a fail-safe that JPA has built into it. It will only ever add new tables to it. It won't remove them if it needs to when it updates it. I will explain more of that as we go through the course and once I have actual examples. So create would just simply create it and remove all of the previous data, including all of the stored information. Create drop would be something more ideal for testing, as that will create the data table at the beginning of your application launch, and then it will destroy it at the end of it. Telling it none will just simply do nothing. And validate, as I said, would be ideal for production, because this is here where it would just validate the schema of the data table and not actually make any changes. So again, we're just going to go with update for now as in development process right now. So that is all of our settings. So now let's go ahead and take a look inside of the Java class. and you'll see that this made a dislibrary.application file for us. It has already annotated it with Spring Boot application, so we can just from here quite literally run the application. Now there are many ways that you can run the application. You can either click on the arrow at the start, on the left of the main methods, or you can come right up here to the top and click on the green little play button. Let's hit play and see what happens. First, enable. If you get a pop-up here asking you to enable annotation processing, just go ahead and enable it. That will allow the Java application to now understand and process the Lombok applications, which, when we get into it, will save us a lot of boilerplate code. So here you see that it's coming up. We are running with Java 17. There's our Spring branding version. You'll notice that it is creating, starting the application with Java 17. No active profile set, so it's using the default profile. That's where it's going in and looking for these. We will set that up later so that we will configure the profiles, and it will just be simply named application-dev.properties. And we'll separate the live one with application-prod.properties. Here you can see the Tomcat is running on port 8080 as we've specified in our application settings. It has started the service, and you'll notice these are all infos. This is also what we had set up in our application properties, telling us at the root logging level we only care about information or higher. So you'll see that we do get a warning, couldn't find any templates, but that's okay, we don't have anything in there yet. So that's cool, but how can we see what that exactly did? Well, for here we could just go into our regular browsers, and we will go to our local host, and because we told it 8080 was our port, we will need to tell it localhost :8080 for the path.